She was sold before she could speak, dressed before she could choose. And tonight, the night they finally put a price on her silence, she ran. But the man who swore to catch her wasn't sent by her father. He was the one she trusted with everything. Watch what happens when a woman discovers that the only cage more dangerous than the one built around her is the one she built herself. Out of faith in the wrong man, stay. Because the moment she stops running is the moment this story truly begins. The candles in Blackthorn Palace were never allowed to burn low. That was the first thing Seraphina Vale had learned as a child. Not how to read, not how to pray, not how to curtsy before men who deserved neither her spine nor her breath. The first lesson the palace had pressed into her like a brand was this: the candles stay lit. Every corridor, every anteroom, every ceremonial hall blazing with light from dusk until dawn, because a king who rules in shadow looks like a man afraid of it. Her father had told her that once, when she was 6 years old, and had asked why the servants looked so exhausted. Appearances are the only currency that matters in this palace, Seraphina. Remember that. Everything else is negotiable. She had spent 23 years watching him negotiate. Tonight, she was done being the collateral. The banquet hall of Blackthorn Palace was a spectacle engineered for submission. 300 candles in iron chandeliers, walls draped in winter violet and gold. The house colors of the Vale dynasty, chosen centuries ago by an ancestor who had apparently believed that a kingdom should look like a bruise. Long tables arranged in a horseshoe formation, every seat occupied by a noble who had already been paid for their applause. The musicians in the gallery above played something slow and ceremonial, something designed to make the air feel sacred and inescapable, the kind of music that didn't invite dancing so much as surrender. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais that put every other human being in the room approximately 6 inches beneath his dignity, sat Prince Aldrich Voss of the Northern Reach. Twice her age, half her patience. Seraphina had been studying him from across the hall for 40 minutes. From the moment she had been led in on her father's arm, presented like a painting that had finally been framed to satisfaction. And in those 40 minutes, she had cataloged everything she needed to know about the man she was supposed to marry before the week was out. The way he held his wine goblet too tightly, white-knuckled, like something that might be taken from him. The way his eyes moved across the room in slow, proprietary arcs, landing on every woman below 30 with the same measuring expression, the same half-second pause before moving on. The way he had looked at her when she entered, not with desire, not even with the performative admiration that protocol demanded, but with the flat, assessing gaze of a man inspecting livestock at market, checking teeth, checking spine, checking whether the investment would hold. She had smiled at him. She had curtsied. She had let her father press her hand into Aldrich's thick, cold fingers while the assembled nobility applauded, and the musicians swelled, and the world watched Princess Seraphina Vale perform perfect, obedient joy. Then she had excused herself to find the powder room, walked calmly through the side corridor off the east gallery, descended 2 flights of servants' stairs, and kept walking until the music above her became a murmur, then a memory. The underground passage beneath Blackthorn Palace was not on any official map. That was the second thing Seraphina had learned as a child. And she had learned it alone, the way children learn all the things that matter, through the persistent, secret labor of paying attention when adults believe they are not being watched. She had been 8 when she first found the lower passage, chasing a candle stub that had rolled through a gap in the chapel floor stones. 12 when she mapped it well enough to trust it. 17 when she had shown it to the only person she had ever trusted with anything real, Lucien. She pressed her palms flat against the stone wall and breathed. The passage smelled of deep earth and standing water and something older than either. The accumulated cold of centuries, stone that had never once known warmth. Her wedding gown dragged behind her, the hem already blackened with grime, the elaborate beadwork along the bodice catching on the rough wall and pulling threads loose with soft, small sounds like the tearing of something that was already halfway gone. She had lifted the front of the skirt with both hands, holding the silk up away from the floor, and in the dim light of the single oil lamp she carried, she was aware of how precisely absurd she must look. Princess of Blackthorn, in her father's white and gold, hauling her own wedding gown through a tunnel that hadn't been swept in 20 years. Good. Let absurdity be the first honest thing she'd worn tonight. The chapel was at the end of the passage. It was not the palace chapel, Not the grand one upstairs with the imported marble altar and the priest her father paid to say whatever the crown needed said. This one was older, predating the palace itself, cut directly into the bedrock beneath the original castle foundations. It had no official name. It had no congregation. The pews were warped and splintered, the stone walls damp with seepage, the vaulted ceiling low enough that a tall man would have to duck at the center arch. Someone, Seraphina had always assumed it was a very long time ago, and had never bothered wondering who, had painted scenes along the curved walls, but the damp had blurred them into shapes that no longer told any clear story. Just figures. Movement. The suggestion of something that had once been believed in so fiercely it had been pressed into stone, and then forgotten. She set the lamp on the altar ledge and sat down in the first pew. The silence was total. Above her through the stone she could feel, not hear, feel, the faint vibration of the banquet hall, the celebration of her sale. Her father's voice would be up there right now, warm and expansive, filling the room with the particular brand of generosity he performed for an audience. King Aldous Vale, the beloved father of Blackthorn's crown jewel, so honored to welcome Prince Aldrich into the family, so moved by this union of kingdoms, so deeply committed to the prosperity and peace that this alliance would ensure. His eyes dry, his wine glass refilled, his daughter nowhere to be found. Let him look. She had perhaps 2 hours before the absence became undeniable, maybe less. Her father's chamberlain, a thin-lipped man named Graves who had spent 30 years anticipating the king's discomforts before they became visible, would notice her missing from the hall within the hour, would do it quietly, would send someone to check the powder room, then the private solar, then the East Gallery. She had perhaps 90 minutes, realistically, before the search became official. Lucienne had said midnight. She looked at the lamp, looked at her hands, clean still, on the knuckles and palms, though her fingers had picked up grime from the passage walls. The ring on her right hand caught the lamplight, her mother's ring, the only thing in this palace that had never belonged to her father first. A small oval of dark amber set in plain silver, worn smooth on the inner band from her mother's years of wearing it, and then from hers. She turned it once around her finger without thinking, the way she always did when she was waiting for something that frightened her. Lucian had said midnight. She had left the hall at 10:30. She was, in the most literal possible sense, early for her own escape. She almost laughed at that. Almost. The laugh would have come out wrong. Too high, too sharp, the particular pitch of a woman who has held everything together so long that the holding has become indistinguishable from the breaking. She pressed her lips together instead and looked at the blurred figures on the chapel wall and let herself, for the first time in weeks, think about what she was actually doing. She was leaving. Not metaphorically. Not in the quiet rebellion of her private thoughts. The way she had been leaving for years. Inside her own skull, planning and imagining and sustaining herself on the idea of elsewhere. She was leaving tonight, actually, and physically, and finally. She was going to walk out of this chapel through the eastern tunnel exit that emptied into the old mill lane behind the palace walls, and Lucienne was going to be there with horses and forged travel documents, and 2 saddlebags of supplies he had been assembling quietly for the past 3 weeks, and they were going to ride north toward the border pass before the snow closed it. She had been over the plan so many times it had worn smooth, like her mother's ring. The part of the plan she didn't say aloud, didn't say to Lucienne, didn't say to herself in any words, only felt in the compressed space behind her sternum where she kept the things that were too large and too uncertain to survive being spoken, was the part about what came after. What they were to each other, she and Lucienne. What the plan meant beyond logistics. He had never said it plainly. She had never demanded that he say it plainly, because demanding the plain thing has always felt, in her experience, like the fastest way to kill it. But there was something between them that had been building for 4 years, since the night he had found her in this exact chapel, 16 and sleepless, and crying for reasons she couldn't have articulated then, and had sat down in the pew beside her without a word and simply stayed until she didn't need to cry anymore. There was something between them that was older than the plan, older than the escape, older than anything she could explain to anyone who had not been in this cold underground room on the night she was 16 and entirely alone. She trusted him. She trusted him the way she trusted the ground beneath her feet, which was to say, completely. and without examining the trust, because to examine it felt like looking down while walking across a narrow bridge. She turned her mother's ring. The lamp burned steadily. Above her, very faintly, the vibration of celebration continued. She waited. She did not know exactly when she fell into the particular half-sleep of exhausted, high-strung waiting, the state in which the body finally sets down the weight of vigilance for a few minutes without the mind's permission. She only knew that at some point the chapel walls had blurred the way they always did when her eyes stopped focusing on them, and her spine had softened against the pew back, and her breathing had slowed, and then voices. Not inside the chapel, adjacent to it, coming through the east wall, which was the thinnest section of the whole lower complex, where the chapel had been built up against the older foundation stone of the original keep. The Mill Lane passage ran alongside it. She had always been able to hear sounds from the passage when she was in here. She had heard rats once, and what she was fairly certain had been a pair of servants using the isolation for something private. And once, years ago, the dripping rhythm of a roof leak that had sounded almost like footsteps until it didn't. What she heard now were not rats, not footsteps, not water. Two men. She sat up straight without making a sound. The instinct was physical and immediate, the animal part of her, the part that had spent 23 years learning how to read the temperature of a room from a doorway before she entered it. The first voice she didn't recognize. Older. Measured. The voice of a man accustomed to negotiating in small spaces who had learned long ago to keep his register low so that only the person directly across from him could hear the words. The king's patience is not infinite, the voice was saying. Clipped, final syllable stress. The accent of someone from the capital's administrative circles. The particular flatness of people who have spent so long around power that they've learned to perform the absence of affect as a marker of closeness to it. He's given you considerable latitude on the timeline, Captain. That latitude has a price. There was a pause, then the second voice, Lucien. She recognized it the way she recognized her own name. The particular low, even cadence of it, the way he put a half-beat of silence before he answered anything. Not hesitation, but deliberation. She had always admired that about him, the way he never said anything he hadn't already finished thinking. "Tell me the terms again," Lucien said. "Precisely. I want to hear it stated." The first man made a small sound. Not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. The sound of a man who is used to repeating himself for people who want things in writing. 200 gold crowns paid in advance to whatever account you designate. The Alden Mere estate in the southern province. Freehold, deeded to you in full. The rank of Lord Commander of the Royal Guard, effective upon the successful completion of the arrangement. And a royal patent of minor nobility, which means your children, should you have any, inherit clean. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. Seraphina counted them without knowing she was counting. "And the condition," Lucien said, "you deliver the princess to the north gate before sunrise, unharmed, presentable, and compliant enough to complete the wedding ceremony within 48 hours. Whatever it takes to accomplish that is at your discretion. The king does not require details." "Whatever it takes," Lucien repeated. Not a question, something else, confirmation of a scope. "She trusts you." The first man's voice was entirely without judgment, which was somehow the worst version of it. "That is the asset. Use it." Another silence, longer this time. "Done," Lucien said. The word landed in the chapel the way stones land in still water. Clean entry, expanding rings, nothing to be done about it after the fact. Seraphina did not move. She was aware, in the crystalline way that the body sometimes becomes aware of itself in moments of acute shock, of every point of contact between herself and the physical world. The pew wood against the backs of her thighs through the silk of the gown. The cold stone floor under her slippered feet. The damp air against her collarbones where the gown's neckline sat. The lamp flame doing exactly what it had been doing, burning steadily, without drama, entirely indifferent to what had just happened to her. She trusts you. That is the asset. Use it. 200 gold crowns. An estate. A title. Clean children. She trusts you. She had not made a sound. She was certain of that. But her body had made its own decision in the moment of impact, the deep animal decision that precedes any conscious thought. Her lungs had contracted. Her hands had found the pew in front of her. Her entire frame had drawn inward and downward, making itself smaller, quieter, less present, while her mind was still catching up to what her ears had already processed and delivered and could not take back. The voices continued for another moment. Logistics, she thought distantly, though she could no longer parse the words into meaning. Route timing, confirmation codes, the language of a transaction being finalized, and then footsteps moving away. Both sets, in opposite directions. She sat in the empty chapel, and the lamp burned, and above her, very faintly, the celebration continued. She did not cry. That was the thing that surprised her most about the next several minutes. She expected something to break open, some structural wall she'd been holding up against precisely this kind of impact, and instead what she found was a coldness that she did not recognize in herself. Not numbness. Numbness was the absence of feeling. This was something else. This was feeling so compressed under its own weight that it had changed state, gone from something liquid and flowing to something dense and still and structural. She thought about the pew, about the night she was 16, about the way he had sat beside her without speaking, and she had eventually stopped crying and they had talked. About nothing, really. About the rats in the lower passage and the history of the old keep, and whether the painted figures on the wall had ever actually been saints or just people someone loved. And it had been the first time in her memory that she had not performed anything for anyone, had simply been present in a room with another person without managing their perception of her. She thought about that. She thought about use it. The coldness deepened. It was almost clarifying, she realized. The way very cold water is clarifying when it hits skin. The shock of it strips everything secondary away and leaves only the essential question, what do you do now? She did what she had always done. She thought clearly. She assessed. Lucien was coming. He knew the chapel, knew this space, knew every entrance, including the one she'd used to enter, the one from the palace passage, and the eastern one that opened onto the mill lane. She had perhaps 10 minutes before he arrived, less maybe. She did not know where he had been standing in the passage when she arrived, did not know how far he'd had to travel to reach the meeting point. He could be 3 minutes away. She could not go back through the palace passage. Not because of Lucien. She could handle Lucien, or she had believed that, and now the word handle felt like it belonged to a different woman's vocabulary. Not because of Lucien, but because going back meant going up, and upstairs was a banquet hall, and in the banquet hall was her father, who had paid for her, who had set the price and found the asset and deployed it with the same dispassion he brought to every transaction that involved her. She stood. The gown moved with her, heavy and elaborate, entirely wrong for what she needed to do next. She looked at the eastern passage door, the one that opened onto the mill lane exit outside the walls. She had the lamp. She had her mother's ring. She had 23 years of paying attention. She had the coldness. She crossed the chapel floor in 8 steps and opened the eastern door and went through it. The mill lane passage was narrow and low-ceilinged, its floor sloping slightly downward toward the exterior, and she moved through it fast, faster than was wise, given the ceiling clearance, and she knocked her temple on a projecting stone and felt the sharp split-second brightness of pain and kept moving because pain was also clarifying, because pain was also essentially information, and right now all information pointed the same direction. The exit was a wooden door, iron-banded, set into the base of the outer wall. It had a drop latch on the inside. She lifted it, felt the resistance of old wood swollen with damp, pushed her shoulder into it, and it gave with a low, grinding protest and swung outward into the night. Cold air hit her face like a hand pressing flat. The mill lane was a narrow, cobbled alley running along the outer base of the palace's western curtain wall. It existed for the servants and the supply wagons, and the things the palace preferred not to manage through its formal gates. And at this hour, past 11, perhaps approaching half past, it was empty. A row of low buildings to the left. The granary and the old mill house from which the lane took its name, their shutters dark. To the right, the lane curved out toward the lower city, toward the streets that would eventually dissolve into the warren of the market quarter, and beyond that, the eastern road. Seraphina stood in the doorway of the outer wall and looked at the empty lane and understood, with a sudden, terrible precision, what being alone meant. She had imagined it, in the way you imagine the thing you plan for. You picture the logistics, the route, the mechanics of movement. She had imagined herself on horseback. She had imagined the border pass, the night air, the sense of distance increasing between herself and Blackthorn. She had even imagined, in weak moments she was not proud of, Lucian's face in the firelight of some distant inn, and what it might look like when he finally said the thing he had never said plainly. She had not imagined this. Standing in a doorway in a wedding gown with no horse, no documents, no supplies, no plan that did not have a traitor at its center, she stepped through the door and let it close behind her. The first thing was the gown. She could not move through the city streets in a royal wedding gown, not at this hour, not without being recognized immediately by anyone who had seen the announcements, the portraits, the months of public ceremony surrounding this marriage alliance. The gown was an identity marker more effective than her face. She needed it gone. She assessed what she had. The gown's outer layer was a heavily embroidered silk overlay that attached to the bodice by a series of hook and eye closures down the back. She'd had to be sewn into the full assembly, but the overlay itself came away separately. Beneath it was the inner gown, which was simpler, plain satin, undecorated, the kind of thing that could pass in low light for any moderately well-dressed woman's formal attire. Still too good for a convincing commoner, still too pale, but manageable. Better. She set the lamp on the cobblestones, reached both arms back, and began working the hook and eye closures of the overlay. She'd had 2 ladies' maids do this every morning and evening of her life. She had, in fact, never done it herself. The angle was wrong. Her wrists ached. She got the top 4, and then couldn't reach the next 3, and for a moment stood in the dark alley grappling with her own gown with an intensity that would have been comic under any other circumstances. And then she simply pulled. The silk tore in 2 places along the side seam, the hooks at her mid-back wrenched free with an audible pop, and the overlay came off in a cascade that she caught only partially, letting the rest fall to the cobblestones in a pile of ruined, expensive fabric that cost more than most families in the lower city earned in 2 years. She stood in the plain satin underlayer and looked at the pile of silk on the ground and felt nothing about it. She picked up the lamp and walked. The lower city at this hour was not empty, but it was not full in the way it was during the day. It was populated by the particular people who belonged to the city's nocturnal register. Night porters, late drinkers making their way home from the tavern district, a group of young men at the corner of the Mill Lane and the first Broad Street, passing something between them, who looked at her and looked away when she didn't slow down. She walked with her chin level and her pace even, the lamp held out ahead of her like a statement, and no one spoke to her. She was thinking, as she walked, about what she actually knew. She knew her father had sent Lucian to retrieve her. She knew. Lucian had accepted. She knew. The terms were specific and valuable, which meant the offer had been calculated. Her father knew Lucian's price, had known it with enough confidence to state it without negotiation. Which meant this had not been improvised tonight. This had been prepared. Which meant Lucien had been her father's contingency for longer than tonight. The cold deepened. She walked faster. She did not let herself think about why this hurt more than the marriage had hurt. The marriage had been arranged without her consent by people who had decided her life was a useful object. That was a harm she had a category for. This was something that needed a new category, and she did not have time to build one. Not right now. Not in a cobblestone alley in a torn wedding gown with royal soldiers who would be mobilized within the hour. She needed to get out of the capital tonight. She had no money. She had no documents. She had 1 oil lamp that was perhaps 2 hours from burning out, and her mother's ring, which was gold and amber, and would sell for enough to buy passage on a merchant cart if she could find someone willing to transact at midnight without asking too many questions. She thought, you have 23 years of watching people make deals. You know what a transaction looks like from every angle of the room. She thought, your father's first lesson. Appearances are the only currency that matters. She walked into the city and let the darkness take her. It was 3 hours later and 3 miles of city behind her when she heard the hoofbeats. She had made it to the outer market ring, the wide, unpaved circuit road that ran around the base of the city's second wall, where the market stalls stood empty and covered at night, their canvas awnings dark. She had sold the lamp, not the ring, not yet. She was not ready to sell the ring. She had sold the lamp to a night market woman who dealt in small goods and asked no questions, for enough coppers to buy a dark wool cloak off a peg outside a closed clothing stall. She had taken it. She would pay for it when she could. She wore the cloak now, the hood up, the pale satin of the underlayer invisible below it. In the dark, on this road, she was indistinguishable from any traveler. The hoofbeats came from behind her. One horse, moving at a controlled canter, not a gallop, not the flat-out speed of someone carrying an emergency, but the deliberate eating pace of someone who was not in a hurry because they were not guessing, because they knew where she was going. She did not turn around. She walked at the same pace. The hoofbeats slowed as they drew closer, and then dropped to a walk and came alongside her and stopped. Seraphina. His voice. The same low, even cadence, the half-beat of deliberation before he spoke. Her name in his mouth like it belonged to him. She stopped walking. She kept her hood up. She kept her face forward. In her chest, the cold thing tightened into something almost architectural. Not a wall, exactly, but a structure. Load-bearing. "Don't," she said. Her own voice surprised her. Flat. Entirely flat. Like the administrative man in the passage. Like someone who has decided that effect is a cost they can no longer afford. Lucian was quiet for a moment. She heard him shift in the saddle. The horse breathed. "Come back with me," he said. "No." "Seraphina, I heard you." She said it without turning around, without raising her voice, without any inflection that might give him a surface to grip. "I was in the chapel. I heard all of it. The estate, the crowns, the title. She trusts you. Use it. I heard you say done." Silence. The horse shifted its weight, hooves quiet on the dirt road. "It's not," he started. "Don't tell me what it is." She turned around then because she needed him to see her face when she said this. Needed him to understand that she was not asking a question, was not inviting a negotiation, was not the 16-year-old girl in the pew who had confused someone staying beside her with someone choosing her. "Whatever you were about to say, the explanation, the reason, the version of events where I'm supposed to feel differently about what I heard, I don't need it. I'm not going to stand in a road at midnight in someone else's cloak and let you spend the next 10 minutes constructing something I might believe if I'm desperate enough. I'm not desperate. I'm clear." He looked at her. In the dark, on horseback, she could not read his expression. She had always been able to read his expression. "You can't make it out of the capital without documentation," he said. He said it the way a man says something that is true and hates that it is true, and is going to say it anyway because the alternative is worse. "They'll have the gates by morning. Graves already knows you're gone. I saw him mobilizing the guard before I came after you. You have maybe 4 hours before every exit is covered." "I know. You don't have the papers. I have them." A pause. "I still have them." She stared at him. The cold structure in her chest held exactly where it was. "You still have the papers," she repeated. "Yes." "The ones you assembled for our escape?" "Yes." She stood very still and thought about that, thought about the shape of it. The man who had sold her to her father for an estate and a title was sitting on a road at midnight telling her he still had the forged documents that would let her leave the country, was offering them to her. Was there something behind his eyes, in the dark, that she couldn't read because she had lost the ability to read him in the last 3 hours? Or had she lost it months ago, slowly, without noticing, the way you lose warmth to a draft you stopped being able to feel because it became the temperature of the room? "Why?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. The deliberation, the half-beat. "Because whatever you think you heard," he said slowly, carefully, each word like something being placed rather than spoken, "isn't the complete—" "I heard you say done," she said again. Quieter this time. Almost gentle, the way you are gentle with something that cannot be changed and must be accepted. "That's the complete thing, Lucian. That's all of it." She turned around and started walking again. Behind her, the horse did not move. She walked 20 paces, 30. The market awnings were pale shapes in the dark on either side of her. The city's second wall rose ahead, its gate dark and closed at this hour. Beyond it, the outer districts. Beyond those, the countryside roads. Behind her, very quietly, the horse began to walk again. She did not stop. She did not turn around. She walked with her chin level and her pace even, and the cold structure bearing the full weight of everything she was not letting herself feel yet, everything she would need to feel later, somewhere else, somewhere far enough from here that the feeling would be survivable. The horse's footsteps remained at exactly the same distance behind her for a long time, until they didn't. She had just reached the shadow of the gate tunnel when she heard it, not behind her, but ahead, above. A single footfall on the gate tower walkway that was not a soldier's measured round and was not the wind. She stopped. A figure dropped from the walkway onto the road in front of her, then another at the mouth of the tunnel. Not soldiers, wrong build, wrong clothing, no palace insignia. The first one had a blade already drawn. The second was holding something at his side in both hands, the posture of someone who expected to use it. Behind her, Lucian's horse came to a stop. The first figure stepped forward into the thin light that spilled from the gate lantern above, and she saw his face, saw nothing familiar in it, saw only the flat professional blankness of a man who has been given a job and intends to complete it, and said, in a voice that she would have sworn did not belong to anyone she knew, "She's the one in the dark cloak. The king wants her alive. Alive is the only specification." Seraphina looked at the man with the drawn blade, looked at the second one, felt the cold structure in her chest begin, for the first time, to fracture, not toward grief, not toward fear, but toward something older and less forgiving than either. Her father had not just sent Lucien. Her father had sent these men first. Lucien's voice came from directly behind her, close now, close enough that she understood he had dismounted without her hearing it. "Don't." The word was short. It was addressed to the men with the blades, not to her. It had a particular quality, not a request, not a warning, but the single syllable of a man who is informing you of what will happen before it happens. The man with the drawn blade looked past her at Lucien. His expression shifted. Not much, the fractional recalibration of someone encountering an unexpected variable. "Captain," he said, "the king's orders are clear. We take her." "The orders," Lucien said. And there was something in his voice now that she had never heard before, something that lived below the even cadence and the deliberate half-beat, something that she could not name because she had never needed a name for it, "are changed." A silence. The four of them in the gate tunnel's mouth, the lantern swaying slightly in the cold air, the blade still drawn, the second man's hand still on whatever he was carrying. "Changed," the first man repeated. Flat. Skeptical. The voice of a man who does not believe the variable is what it claims to be. "Changed," Lucien said, "and if you need to confirm that with the king before you stand down, I suggest you ride fast, because in approximately 4 hours, the northern road out of this city is going to be full of soldiers, and the window we have right now to resolve this without anyone dying is shorter than you think." Another silence. The first man looked at Seraphina, looked at Lucien, looked at the blade in his own hand with the brief, assessing expression of a man running calculations. Then he lowered it, slowly, the particular reluctance of someone who is not convinced but has decided the risk arithmetic doesn't favor the alternative. "This comes back on you," he said. "I know," Lucien said. The two men stepped to the side of the tunnel mouth, not gone, watching, waiting, memorizing, but not moving to block. Seraphina stood exactly where she was. She did not look at Lucien. She looked at the dark road beyond the gate tunnel, at the outer districts and the countryside roads that lay somewhere beyond them, at the future she had promised herself was possible, and which had been bought and sold, and apparently was now being… what? Returned? Offered back? Given as a gift by the man who had accepted payment for it 40 minutes ago? She thought, what just happened? She thought, I still don't know if that was real. She thought, I cannot afford to trust the thing I cannot afford to be wrong about. "The papers," she said, her voice still flat, still even. The administrative man's voice, which had become, she was beginning to understand, her voice when she needed to survive. "Show me the papers." She heard him reach into his coat, heard the faint sound of a document fold being opened. He stepped alongside her, not in front, not behind, alongside, and held them out, and she took them without looking at his face. She looked at the documents, the forged seal, the travel name, Marin Ashvale, Merchant's Ward, traveling to her aunt in the border province. Good work. The seal was good enough for a night gate inspection. She looked at the documents for a long time, Then she looked up, and for the first time since the chapel, she looked at Lucien directly. She looked at his face and saw something she couldn't name. Something that occupied the precise space where the calm, readable certainty she had always relied on had been, and which was neither the certainty nor its absence, but something else entirely. Something rawer than she had ever seen on him. Something she did not know whether to believe in, because the only evidence she had for whether to believe it was evidence that had already been corrupted once tonight. "If you're doing this because you feel guilty," she said, very quietly, "I need you to understand that guilt is not a reason I can use. It doesn't keep me warm. It doesn't get me across the border. If you help me tonight and then tomorrow you go back to my father and tell him where I went, guilt is just the reason you gave yourself for why you delayed." He looked at her and said nothing. "So," she said, "tell me the true thing, if there is one." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the lantern above the gate swayed twice. Long enough that the two watching men shifted their weight, impatient, recording. Long enough that she began to believe there was no true thing, or that if there was, he didn't know how to say it. And then he said, very quietly, so quietly that she wasn't entirely sure it was meant for her to hear, "I took the deal, so he'd stop looking for other options." The cold structure in her chest held. She looked at him. She looked at the gate. She looked at the dark road beyond. And then, not because she believed him, not because the cold thing had thawed even 1 degree, not because she had forgiven anything or understood anything or decided anything except that she was still moving and the window was still open, she walked through the gate, and after a moment she heard him follow. 3 miles outside the Capitol walls, just as the first gray thickening of the sky began in the east, Seraphina found the first thing her father had never wanted her to find. Not the tunnel, not the chapel, not the passage to freedom. A village with no lights, no cooking smoke, no sound, and a well with a crown marker burned into the post above it, indicating royal seizure, meaning the water had been taxed. She stood at the edge of the road and stared at the dark village and felt the cold structure in her chest shift, not fracture. Shift. From one shape to another. Behind her, Lucien had stopped. "How long?" she asked. He said nothing. "How long has he been doing this?" She turned around. "To the villages." "How long have you known?" And in the gray pre-dawn light, on the empty road outside a seized and silenced village, she watched the man she had once trusted with everything finally run out of the particular silence that had kept them both alive. What he said next changed every calculation she'd been making, and not in the direction she expected. The village had no name on any map she had ever been shown. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the silence, not the dark windows, not the absence of smoke from chimneys that should have been burning at this hour, even in early autumn. The first thing was the absence of a name. She had studied every map in the palace library, had memorized the road networks and the provincial boundaries and the names of settlements from the capital outward in every direction, had done it the way she did everything inside those walls. Compulsively, privately, against the day she might need the information for something her father would not approve of. She knew the names of villages so small they were marked by a single dot, and a notation in a cartographer's handwriting so small it required a glass to read. This place did not exist on those maps, which meant someone had decided it shouldn't. She stood at the edge of the road and looked at it. Perhaps 30 structures, stone and timber, low-roofed, the kind of construction that meant several generations of a family sheltering together under the same beams. A well at the center, ringed with flat stones, the wooden post above it bearing the burned mark she had already identified. A crown inside a circle, which was the royal seizure marker, which meant the water source had been legally claimed under the King's Revenue Act as a taxable resource. She had known the Revenue Act existed. She had read it in the library, in a legal compendia her father kept current, the kind of document written in language so dense and administrative that the violence inside it only becomes visible if you know how to translate between the words. She had not understood, reading it, that it meant this, that it meant a post above a well, that it meant no cooking smoke, that it meant 30 buildings with no lights. "How long?" she said again, because Lucien had not answered the first time, and the second time was not a request for information so much as a demand that he participate in what was happening. She heard him take a breath, the particular breath of a man about to say something he has been deciding whether to say for a long time. 6 years, he said. The seizure program started 6 years ago, quietly at first. 1 village in each province, framed as temporary wartime measures after the northern border disputes. By the time the disputes resolved, the infrastructure was established and no one in the council had the leverage to dismantle it. She turned around and looked at him fully. In the gray pre-dawn light, his face was stripped of the darkness that had half hidden it at the gate, and she could see it clearly for the first time since the chapel. The particular exhaustion on him, the kind that doesn't come from one night of hard riding, but from years of knowing something and carrying it in silence. "You knew," she said. "Yes." "For 6 years?" "Yes." She was quiet, not because she had nothing to say, because what she had to say required her to choose it carefully, and she was still in the process of choosing. The cold structure in her chest had shifted again, was reorganizing itself around new information, building outward. It was not grief. It was not rage. It was something that lived beneath both of those, something more load-bearing. "The villages on the northern road," she said, "the ones I would have passed through during the escape, the ones you knew I'd pass through." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "You were going to let me cross the border," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, without ever knowing what was on the other side of it, what was behind me, what my name was attached to. "I was going to get you out alive," he said. "That was the priority. That was your priority." She took a step toward him, not aggressive, measured, the way she moved through every room she was not certain of. "My priority is different, it turns out." He looked at her with that unreadable expression, the new one she didn't have a name for yet, and said nothing. She turned back toward the village. She looked at the well post with its crown mark. She looked at the dark windows. She looked at the road continuing beyond the settlement, deeper into the countryside, toward more unnamed places. "I want to see inside one of them," she said. "Seraphina." "I'm not asking." She walked toward the nearest structure before he could finish whatever he was going to say. She heard him follow, heard the crunch of road grit under his boots, heard him catch up and pull even with her without speaking. They walked into the settlement together in silence, and the silence was a different quality than the silence had been on the road. It had texture to it, the particular density of a place that was inhabited but not alive. People somewhere behind those walls in the compressed stillness of people who had learned that stillness was the safest posture. She stopped at the door of the nearest building, knocked. Nothing. She knocked again. Not hard, Mom. Not the knock of authority, which she understood was the last thing she wanted to present herself as in a village that had been seized by authority. She knocked the way you knock when you want someone to understand you are not a threat, which is a different rhythm, a different weight of knuckle, a long silence. Then a sound from inside, the careful, minimal sound of someone moving without wanting to be heard moving. Then nothing. She said quietly to the door, "I'm not from the Crown. I'm traveling north. I'm alone." She paused. Then, because she made the calculation that honesty was the only currency this door would open for, "I'm wearing a torn wedding gown under a stolen cloak, and I have no idea what I'm doing, and I need to understand what this place is." Another long silence. Then a bolt drew back. The door opened 3 inches, held by an interior chain, and an eye looked out at her. Dark, adult, entirely without the kind of fear that flinches. The fear that doesn't flinch is more serious, she had always known, than the fear that does. The eye moved from her to Lucien, stopped. "He's with me," she said. "He's not going to do anything." She felt Lucien tense beside her at the phrasing, and did not adjust it. The chain came off. The door opened. She was inside for 40 minutes. Lucien waited at the door. When she came back out, she stood in the gray early morning for a moment without speaking, and Lucien watched her face, and whatever he saw on it made him stay quiet, which was the correct instinct. The woman inside had been named Marette, 40 years old, approximately, with the hands of someone 20 years older and the eyes of someone who had decided, somewhere in the recent past, to stop expecting anything good. She had 3 children in the back room. She had not let Seraphina see them, had positioned herself between Seraphina and the inner door, with the practiced automaticity of a woman who has been doing that positioning for a long time. She had spoken in short sentences, the sentences of someone who had learned that more words meant more surface area for misunderstanding, and she had told Seraphina the following things without being asked to tell her anything at all, simply because she assessed that Seraphina could hear them without the information being used against her. The water tax had been implemented 4 years ago. 1 copper per bucket drawn, payable to the crown collector who came through monthly. 1 copper per bucket was, at the rate an average family required water for cooking and drinking and basic sanitation, approximately a third of a laborer's daily wage. The families who could not pay had their supply chits revoked, which meant they could draw from the well only on credit, which accumulated, which was eventually converted into labor debt, which bound the debtor to crown work projects at non-negotiable rates. There were currently 11 families in this settlement on labor debt. The crown work project nearest to them was a road construction operation 3 days' ride east, where the workers were housed in company structures and fed on company rations and paid in company scrip redeemable only at company stores at prices set by the company, which was to say by the crown. The road being constructed ran from the northern border pass to the capital. The road being constructed was part of the military access infrastructure included in the alliance agreement with the Northern Reach. Prince Aldrich's infrastructure, built on water tax labor, laid into the ground by men who had drawn too much water to survive and been charged for the right to be thirsty. Seraphina stood outside the closed door of Moret's house and breathed the cold morning air and felt the cold structure in her chest complete its reorganization. It had found its final shape. It was not anger. Anger was reactive, and this was not reactive. It was forward-facing. It was the shape of a woman who has just understood what she is actually standing in the middle of, and has decided that standing in the middle of it is not, in fact, the position she intends to maintain. "The road," she said. Lucien had gone very still. "The military access road from the border pass, the one that makes the alliance with Aldrich functional, the one that is the actual strategic value of the marriage agreement. Isn't it? Not the marriage, not the nominal alliance, but the road. The physical infrastructure for moving northern troops into the interior of the kingdom." He said nothing. "My father didn't negotiate a marriage," she said. "He negotiated an occupation, and he built the road for it using people who had no choice but to build it because he had taxed their water supply into debt." The silence between them had a new quality now. Not the silence of a man who has nothing to say, but the silence of a man who has been carrying this specific weight for long enough that watching someone else pick it up is almost a physical experience for him. "When did you know?" she asked. "About the road specifically, or about all of it?" "Start with all of it." He exhaled, the breath of a man setting something down. 2 years ago, I was assigned to escort the king's infrastructure commissioner through the southern province on an inspection tour. I saw the work camps. I saw the accounting. I asked questions and was told to stop asking them, and when I didn't stop, I was transferred to palace duty, which put me closer to the king and further from the provinces, which I understood was the point. "But you stayed." "I stayed." "Why?" He looked at her. In the morning light, his jaw was set in a way she recognized, the same set it had the night he'd told her, 4 years ago, that the best way to survive Blackthorn Palace was to become more useful to it than it needed to be to you. She had thought, at the time, that it was a mercenary philosophy. She had thought it from the safety of a princess's position, which meant she had thought it from a position of someone who had never had to apply it. "Because you were in the palace," he said. She stared at him. "And because I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought if I stayed useful enough and quiet enough, and if I built enough credit with the people who make the decisions, there would eventually be a moment when I could do something with it. A moment when the credit cashed out into something that mattered. Like tonight. Like tonight." She turned away from him and walked toward the center of the settlement, toward the well with the crown mark on its post. She stood at the well and put both hands on the flat stone rim and looked down into the dark water below. Her own reflection looked back up at her, pale, blurred at the edges, wearing a stolen cloak over a ruined wedding dress, which was, she thought, perhaps the most honest portrait that had ever been made of her. She reached into the neck of the cloak and found her mother's ring on its finger. She turned it once. Then she said, to the water, to the reflection, to whatever it was she was talking to when she said the things she didn't say to anyone. "You can still cross the border. The papers are good. Marin Ashvale, Merchant's Ward. You can still be her." She looked at the crown mark on the post above the well. She looked at the road behind her running back toward the capital. She looked at the road ahead, running north toward the pass. She thought about Maret's hands, about the children in the back room, about 11 families in labor debt building a road for the man she was supposed to have married 6 hours ago. She thought about the maps in the palace library that didn't have this place on them, about the Revenue Act in the legal compendia with its dense administrative violence, about her father's voice in the banquet hall, warm and generous and full of the kind of love that requires an audience. She took her hands off the well rim. "I need paper," she said. "Whatever you have, and something to write with." She heard Lucien move behind her, heard him open a saddlebag. "I have a journal, field notes. Give me a clean page." He tore one out and brought it to her along with a graphite stick, and she pressed the page against the stone rim of the well and began to write. Her handwriting was formal, trained. She had been schooled in the royal documentary hand, which was clear and unambiguous, and had been developed specifically for documents that needed to be legible under adverse conditions. She wrote quickly, from memory, without drafting. She wrote the names of the villages she had just learned. She wrote the structure of the water tax and the labor debt conversion and the connection to the road project and the connection to the alliance agreement. She wrote the terms of that agreement as she understood them from years of overhearing her father's closed-door council sessions from the corridor outside, where she had stood many times in the posture of a woman simply passing and listened with every faculty she had. She wrote for 15 minutes. Then she folded the page and put it inside the cloak against her body. "Where are the documents?" she said. "The real documents. The alliance agreement, the terms of the military access provision. Where does my father keep them?" Lucien was quiet. "Not the public version," she said. "The real one. The one with Aldrich's signature and the infrastructure clauses." "The King's private archive," he said. "Sub-level of the East Wing. It requires 2 keys, the King's seal key and the archivist's counter key." "Where is the archivist's counter key?" A pause. "Seraphina." "Where?" "The archivist's office, East Corridor, 2nd floor, under the floor stone beneath the desk." He said it the way a man says something he has spent a long time deciding not to say, and has just now decided otherwise. "I know because I escorted the archivist during the last document rotation, 3 months ago. He didn't know I saw where he replaced it." She looked at him for a long time. "You've been building a case," she said. Something moved across his face. Not confirmation, something more conflicted than confirmation. "I've been keeping track." "Those are different things." "Yes," he said. "They are." She understood then what she was looking at when she looked at him. Not a traitor who had found a conscience. Not a loyal man who had made one catastrophic compromise. Something more uncomfortable than either. A man who had been making a calculation so long and so quietly that even he had lost the thread of what it was originally in service of. A man who had stayed useful to a corrupt system for the stated purpose of eventually being useful against it, and who had arrived at the moment of having to choose between those two things without being entirely certain which one he was doing when he made the choice. She understood it because she recognized the architecture. She had been living inside a version of it for 23 years. "I'm going back," she said. The words dropped into the morning air without drama. She said them the way you say a thing that is already decided, that has been decided since the moment the cold structure completed its reorganization, that was never actually in question once she understood what she was standing in the middle of. Lucien stared at her. "To the capital," she said, "to get the documents. Both sets, the alliance agreement with the infrastructure clauses, and whatever financial records exist for the water tax and labor program. Whatever it takes to prove the full structure of it. The city will be completely locked down by now," he said. His voice had shifted. Not panic. Lucien didn't panic, but a sharp recalibration, the voice of a man whose plans have just been turned inside out, and who is doing rapid arithmetic in real time. "Every gate will have guards with your description. The palace will be on full alert. Your father will have, I know what he'll have done." She turned back toward the road. "That's why I need you to get me in a different way." He caught her arm, not rough. A grip. A stopping. She looked at his hand on her arm and then looked at his face, and he said low and intent, "If we go back, there is no version of this that ends quietly. You understand that. If you go back to get those documents, you're not running anymore. You're declaring something, and when you declare it, it cannot be undeclared. Whatever happens after that, there's no border pass, there's no escape route, There's no version where you become Marin Ashvale. She looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. I know, she said. You've been free for 6 hours, he said. The rawness on him again, the thing she didn't have a name for. 6 hours, that's all you've had. It's enough. She met his eyes directly. I know what it feels like now. That's enough to know what to fight for. He held her arm for another moment. The morning light was strengthening, the sky pulling toward the pale gray that preceded actual dawn, and in it his face was entirely visible for the first time. Not the composed, deliberate face she had spent 4 years reading, but the one under it. The one that had been under it the whole time, and that she was only now seeing because the circumstances had finally stripped the composed version down to the frame. He let go of her arm. The East Servants' Road, he said. There's a supply entrance at the base of the kitchen garden wall. I know the guard rotation. There's a 40-minute window beginning at the shift change that happens at full dawn. If we ride hard, we can make it. She looked at him. The long look of a woman who is not trusting and is not pretending to trust and is making the only calculation available to her, which is that his information is the only information she has, and the road is the only road that exists, and she is going down it regardless. Then we ride, she said. They rode hard. The city at full dawn was exactly what Lucian had predicted. The gate she had exited through hours earlier was now staffed by 6 guards instead of the usual 2. And from the ridge above the road she could see the palace walls with additional torches burning along the battlements. Could see the movement of people in the outer districts who were not yet awake, but had been made awake by something, by orders moving outward from the palace like a stone thrown into water. The servants' road was a rutted track that ran alongside the outer kitchen garden wall, accessible from the agricultural lane that the supply wagons used. They left the horses in a stand of trees 200 yards out, and she changed the cloak. There was a plain servant's wrap in the second saddlebag, dark wool, nondescript, the kind of thing that belonged on the body of someone who was exactly where they were supposed to be. She changed into it without commentary and tied her hair back under a work cap and became, with the practiced ease of a woman who had been performing versions of herself for other people her entire life, someone who looked entirely unremarkable. Lucien had changed too. Civilian clothes over his guard's underlayer, no insignia. They walked the last 200 yards to the kitchen gate side by side, and she kept her eyes forward and her breathing even. And the single guard at the gate looked at Lucien and looked at her and said, "Early." And Lucien said, "Supply run fell through, doubling back." And the guard waved them through with the incurious efficiency of a man who has been on shift since midnight and is not paid to care about supply logistics. Inside the wall, the kitchen garden was empty. Beyond it, the servants' wing and the interior corridors of Blackthorn Palace, and the East Wing, and the archive, and everything she had come back for. She put her foot on the first stone step that led up from the garden path toward the servants' door, and felt the particular weight of the decision settle onto her. Not heavy, exactly, but real. The weight of something that has become irreversible. She thought, 6 hours ago you were sitting in a chapel waiting for someone to save you. She thought, that was the last time you waited for that. She pressed her hand flat against the door and pushed it open, and walked back into Blackthorn Palace for the last time as someone other than herself. They were 3 corridors deep into the East Wing, moving in the wall-hugging quiet of people who had practiced moving quietly in this building when they heard the footsteps ahead, and both stopped simultaneously and pressed into the alcove beside the tapestry. And the footsteps didn't pass. They stopped. A voice came through the darkness. Not a guard, not a servant. A voice she knew. "I wondered," said Graves, the chamberlain, from somewhere she couldn't see him, in the perfect, undramatic tones of a man who has been awake all night and expected this outcome from approximately the 3rd hour of it. "Whether you'd come back for the archive or attempt to cross the border with nothing but the captain's travel documents. I had it at even odds until approximately an hour ago when the northern gate reported the papers unused. After that I adjusted my estimate somewhat." A pause. A soft sound of movement. Not advance, just repositioning. "The king would like to speak with you, Your Highness, before this goes further than it already has." Seraphina felt Lucian's hand close around her wrist in the dark, not pulling her back, just present, just there. She thought about the papers folded against her body, the names of the villages, the structure of the water tax, the foundation of what she needed to build into something that could not be ignored. She thought, he has the archive keys. He's been here all night. He knew you were coming before you decided to come. She thought, your father does not send graves to arrest people. He sends graves when he wants to negotiate. She stepped out of the alcove into the corridor light and looked at the chamberlain's thin, watchful face and said, in the voice of a woman who has crossed a line she drew herself and has no intention of pretending otherwise, tell him I'll speak with him, but not in the throne hall and not alone. He knows the chapel. He can come down to me. Graves looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change. It never changed. That was the particular skill of him, the face that gave nothing and therefore received everything. And then he said very quietly, Your Highness, your father does not go to anyone. He will, she said, or the document I wrote this morning reaches every noble house in the capital by noon. I know enough already to make that worth their attention. He should consider how much more I'll know after I reach the archive. The silence that followed was not a long one, but it was the kind of silence that marks the end of one thing and the beginning of another. The silence of a man recalculating, adjusting, carrying a new message back to the person who sent him. The silence of a negotiation that has just discovered the other party has more leverage than anticipated. Graves turned and walked back the way he had come. And in the corridor of Blackthorn Palace, in the gray morning light, Seraphina looked at the door to the east wing ahead of her and understood that she had just done something that could not be undone. She had stopped running. And somewhere above her, behind the walls of the palace her family had built, her father had just received the news that the asset had become the adversary. And everything that came next depended on which of them had more to lose. Graves did not look back. That was the thing she noticed as the chamberlain walked away down the corridor. The absolute absence of hesitation in his stride. The way he turned the corner at the end of the east passage without a single backward glance. Not to confirm she was still there. Not to verify she hadn't moved. Not even the instinctive animal check that most people perform when they leave a volatile situation. He simply walked away with the unhurried certainty of a man who already knew how the next hour would resolve itself. She had been reading rooms her entire life. She read that one in the 2 seconds it took Graves to disappear around the corner, and what she read sat in her chest alongside the cold structure and added its weight to it. He wasn't surprised, she said. No, Lucien said. He was waiting. Not outside the archive. Here, in this corridor. He knew which route we'd use. A pause that was half a beat too long. She turned and looked at Lucien's face and found it composed in the way it was composed when he was making a calculation he hadn't finished yet. The jaw set. The eyes moving over some internal landscape she couldn't see. The servant's entrance, she said. The guard rotation. The 40-minute window at dawn. She said each piece slowly, not as an accusation, not yet, as reconstruction. The methodical assembly of a sequence. You knew those things because you're captain of the Royal Guard. Yes. And Graves knows those things for the same reason. The silence confirmed it. She breathed in through her nose, held it, let the full shape of it assemble in her mind without flinching from any of the edges. He let us in, she said. Seraphina. My father let us in. Her voice stayed flat, stayed even, stayed in the register she had found on the market road in the early hours of the morning. The one that belonged to a woman who had decided affect was a cost she could not afford. He knew I'd come back for the archive. He knew which entrance we'd use. He let us walk into the building. Lucien looked at her and said nothing, which was its own answer. She turned and looked at the corridor ahead, at the direction Graves had gone, at the east wing beyond it with its archive and its keys and its documents that she had constructed an entire strategy around reaching. She thought about the 40-minute window, about how smoothly the guard at the kitchen gate had waved them through, about Graves standing in exactly the right corridor at exactly the right moment, in a palace that was supposedly on full alert, with none of the urgency of a man who had been searching. A trap did not need bars. A trap only needed to be the place you were most motivated to go. He wants the confrontation on his ground, she said. Yes. Not a quiet arrest, a confrontation, which means he needs something from it. She turned back to Lucien. What does he need? You, publicly compliant or publicly broken. Either one serves the wedding timeline. He said it without inflection. the voice of a man reciting operational logic, because operational logic was the only honest language available to him right now. A princess who came back voluntarily is easier to present than a princess who was dragged back. And if the confrontation happens inside the palace with no witnesses outside the household, whatever version of it he tells is the version that becomes true. She understood that. She understood it with the particular clarity of someone who had watched her father construct versions of events her entire life, who had seen how cleanly and completely a narrative could be built when you controlled every person in the room where it happened. She also understood something else. He doesn't know about the document, she said. The one I wrote at the well. The names, the tax structure, the road connection. She pressed her hand against her ribs through the servant's wrap, felt the folded page against her body. He knows I went into the village. He may know I spoke to someone, but he doesn't know what I have. Lucien looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, but the fractional adjustment of a man whose arithmetic has just changed. The archive, she said. We still need the archive. The document I have is a foundation, not a structure. Without the official records, without the actual alliance agreement with the infrastructure clauses and the revenue accounting, it's my handwriting on a torn journal page. It's allegation, it's not proof. The archive is exactly where he wants you to go. Then we go there anyway. She started walking, and we get in and out before he's ready for us to have gotten in and out. Lucien caught up with her in 2 strides. They moved through the east corridor at the pace of servants with a clear destination. Not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to suggest uncertainty. The palace was in a particular early morning state, the domestic machinery of it beginning to engage, the kitchen staff audible somewhere below through the floor, the household starting its daily performance of normalcy even while its upper layers were operating in a state of crisis. She knew this rhythm. She had lived inside it for 23 years. She knew which corridors had foot traffic at dawn and which ones didn't, knew where the household guards took their shift change positions and how long they spent in transition, knew the palace's timetable better than most of the people who worked in it, because she had spent years studying it from inside a gilded constraint with nothing else to do but pay attention. The archivist's office was on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, at the end of a corridor lined with storage rooms and administrative offices that were empty at this hour. The door was unlocked. Archivists did not lock their offices, because the archive itself was the secured location, and the office was merely its administrative anteroom. She went in first. Lucien stood in the doorway watching the corridor. The desk was large, solid oak, positioned in the center of the room with the particular dominance of furniture that has never been moved. She went around it, crouched, pressed her palm flat against the floor stones. 3rd from the left, 2nd from the wall. She felt it before she found it. The fractional difference in the stone seating, the one that didn't sit entirely flush with its neighbors, the one that rocked the smallest amount under pressure. She got her fingernails into the edge and lifted. The key was wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, small, iron, unremarkable. She unwrapped it and held it and looked at it for a moment, the physical object that was the difference between what she had and what she needed. She put it in the pocket of the servant's wrap and stood. Lucien was looking at something down the corridor. His posture had changed, the particular stillness of a man who has heard something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. "How long do we have?" she said quietly. "Less than I thought." He pulled back from the doorway. "There are 4 men at the end of the corridor, not moving, waiting." She crossed to the doorway and looked. 4 guards, palace livery, armed, standing at the corridor's junction with the absolute stillness of men who had been placed there and told not to move until told to move. They were not looking in her direction. They were positioned to block the corridor's only other exit. She pulled back. "The archive entrance," she said. "Which direction?" "Back the way we came." "Past them or through the east stairwell?" He looked at her. "The stairwell comes out directly in front of the archive entrance, but it also comes out in front of the throne hall." She looked at the window. 2nd floor, 8-foot drop to the kitchen garden path below, which ran back toward the servants' wing and eventually toward the interior courtyard. She looked at the door. She looked at Lucien. She thought about her father sitting somewhere in this building, waiting with the patience of a man who has placed all his pieces and is simply waiting for the other player to move. She thought, he expects you to go to ground, to hide, to reassess, to spend time you don't have on choosing the careful route. She opened the office door and walked back into the corridor and turned toward the stairwell. She heard Lucien make a sound that was not quite a word, the compressed non-sound of a man suppressing a reaction. And then he followed, because he was Lucien, and that was what he did. And she held that fact in her chest, not as comfort, but as information she would not waste. The stairwell was empty. They descended fast, and at the bottom she stopped with her hand on the door and listened, and heard nothing on the other side, and opened it. The corridor outside the throne hall was not empty. It was not guards. That was the first thing she processed, and then she processed the rest of it, and the rest of it was worse. Standing in the corridor outside the throne hall, in full formal dress, was Lord Aldrich Voss of the Northern Reach. He was flanked by 4 of his own men, northern soldiers in northern livery, heavy wool and iron, the particular physicality of men from a cold country who had been doing violent work long enough that the violence had settled into their posture as a resting state. Aldrich himself was looking directly at her as though he had known precisely which door she would emerge from, which he had, her father would have told him, would have positioned him here, would have stage-managed this with the same careful hand that stage-managed everything. He was even larger in full daylight than he had been across the banquet hall, broad through the shoulders in a way that had less to do with health than with years, a face that had once been handsome in a conventional way and had been weathered past that into something harder and less readable. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the banquet hall, the assessing gaze, the marketplace evaluation, and she saw, with a cold and precise clarity, that there was nothing behind that gaze that was going to complicate itself by hearing anything she had to say. "Your Highness," he said. His accent was thick, the northern vowels flat and hard-edged. "You look different without the dress." Lucien moved to her left, a shift of position that was not subtle and was not meant to be. Aldrich's eyes moved to him with the slow incuriosity of a man who finds a guard dog more amusing than threatening. "Captain, I've heard about your complicated evening." "My lord," Lucien said, completely neutral, the voice of a man who is not going to give anything away to this particular person. Aldrich looked back at Seraphina. "Your father suggested I meet you here. He thought it might be productive for us to speak before the formal reconciliation. His word, not mine." He let a small pause open. "I would have used a different word." She looked at him steadily. The cold structure bore the weight of his gaze without adjusting. "What word?" she said. "Reckoning." He said it without hostility, which was somehow the most hostile version of it. "You embarrassed the house. You embarrassed me. In front of every significant family in this kingdom." He took a single step forward, not threatening exactly, the step of a man who is accustomed to all the space in a room belonging to him by default. "I'm willing to proceed with the arrangement. That is a significant concession under the circumstances, and I want you to understand it as such." "I understand what it is," she said. "Then you understand what it requires." "Compliance," she said, "public and visible, enough to satisfy whatever your advisors told you need to make the alliance credible after last night." She held his gaze. "And the road." Something flickered across his face. A fractional adjustment, the smallest recalibration of a man who had not expected that word from her mouth. It was gone in under a second, but she had been reading rooms her whole life, and she caught it. "The military access road," she said. "The one currently under construction in the southern province, using labor sourced from the water tax program. The one that represents the actual strategic value of this alliance. Not the marriage, the infrastructure. The marriage is the ceremony. The road is the point." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has just recategorized the thing in front of him. "Your father told me you were decorative," he said. "My father tells people what's useful." "Yes." He looked at her with something that was not respect but was adjacent to it, the reluctant assessment of a man encountering an obstacle he hadn't accounted for. "He does." He looked at Lucien, then back at her. "The road is 3 months from completion. The alliance is mutually beneficial. Your personal feelings about the mechanism of it are not a variable that affects the math." "They are now," she said. "Because I have the mechanism documented. The villages, the tax structure, the labor conversion, the connection to the road project. I have it in writing, with names." She pressed her hand once against her ribs, the gesture small enough that only someone watching closely would catch it. And I have the archivist's key. The corridor went very quiet. Aldrich's smile was gone. In its place was the flat, functional expression of a man doing rapid and serious arithmetic. His 4 soldiers had shifted, the subtle weight redistribution of men who have received a silent signal and are waiting for the next one. "You can't get to the archive, John," he said. "The corridor is blocked." "I don't need the archive," she said. "I need you to understand that I have enough without it to take to every noble house in this capital and start a conversation your road cannot survive." She looked at him directly, steadily, without raising her voice. "So the question is not whether you want me compliant. The question is what compliance is actually worth to you versus what the alternative costs." The silence stretched. Aldrich looked at her with the eyes of a man who had spent his life in rooms where power was distributed by force and volume, and the willingness to do what the other person would not do, and who was encountering, possibly for the first time, a version of power that didn't operate on any of those frequencies. Then he looked at Lucian, a long, measuring look. "The captain," he said slowly, "is the variable you haven't accounted for, Your Highness." She heard something in his voice that she did not understand yet, and then she heard the door at the end of the corridor open, and she turned, and she understood it. 2 of the 4 guards from the upstairs corridor came through the door. Between them, supported at the arms in the manner of someone who was not being given the option of walking under their own direction, was a woman Seraphina had never seen before. Middle-aged, dark-haired, wearing the plain clothing of a craftsperson or a mid-city tradesperson. She was not visibly harmed. She was looking at Lucian with the expression of someone who has been kept in a room for a long enough time that the fear of it has compressed into something that no longer looks like fear from the outside. Seraphina looked at the woman, looked at Lucien. The color had left his face. Not all of it. Not the dramatic pallor of shock in a story where shock is performed. The specific, particular draining of color from a person who has just seen the thing they most specifically and precisely did not want to see. The thing they had built every calculation around preventing. The thing that rendered all previous calculations beside the point. "Lucien," she said, quietly. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the woman. Aldrich spoke from behind her, his voice carrying the easy cadence of a man recounting something that had already been decided before she entered the corridor. "The king found her this morning. Apparently the captain had been keeping a private arrangement for some time. A woman, a child, in the lower city." A pause. "Did you know about that, Your Highness?" She did not answer. She was watching Lucian's face. "The captain's cooperation tonight," Aldrich continued, "was more complex than perhaps you appreciated. He was managing multiple obligations simultaneously." The smile was back, smaller now, more precise. "As it turns out, his obligation to the woman is more durable than his obligation to you." She understood it all at once. Not in sequence, not the ordered assembly of information she had been working through all night, but simultaneously the full structure of it arriving complete. The deal her father had offered Lucian. The reason Lucien had said done. The thing he had been protecting that was not a title, not an estate, not a patent of nobility. The thing that had made him useful to her father in the first place. The pressure point that had been identified and applied long before last night, long before the banquet, long before any of this had a shape she could see. She trusts you. That is the asset, not her trust in Lucien. Her father had never cared about her trust. The asset was Lucien himself, a man with something to lose, something real and specific and defenseless, something that could be reached by a king who had spent 30 years reaching into people's lives and finding what they could not protect on their own. She looked at Lucian and saw a man who had been caught between 2 impossible choices long before she had presented him with a third one, and who had been trying, possibly genuinely trying, she could not be certain, she could not afford certainty, to navigate all 3 at once without losing anything that mattered. She looked at the woman, at her face, at the specific compressed fear that wasn't fear anymore. The cold structure in her chest did not break. It did something else. It expanded outward, took in the full dimensions of the room, incorporated everything. Aldrich's satisfaction, Lucien's stillness, the woman's face, the guards at every exit, her father's architecture holding all of it in place from somewhere above and behind all of this, pulling the strings of a system he had spent decades building. and she stood inside it and felt the full weight of what had been done and what was being done and what would be done if she let it continue, and did not look away from any of it. "What's her name?" she said. To Lucien, quietly. His jaw tightened. "Seraphina, don't—" Her name. A long pause. "Calla." She looked at Calla. Calla looked back at her with the flat, careful expression of someone who has decided to take in information without displaying a response to it. The expression of someone who has learned that displaying responses is how people find the things to use against you. She recognized that expression. She had worn it herself for 23 years. She looked at Aldrich. She looked at the guards. She looked at the corridor with its blocked exits and its positioned men and the throne hall door behind Aldrich like the mouth of something. She thought, this is the room your father built for you, every choice he anticipated, every exit he covered, every pressure point he identified and positioned someone beside. The version of you he has spent 23 years constructing in his mind. The version that can be managed, that can be leveraged, that can be brought back into line by applying pressure to the right place at the right time. That version would stand in this corridor and make the calculation that the cost of resistance is higher than the cost of compliance. She thought, he's never been right about which version of you he was dealing with because he's never had to be. You've never required him to be right. You've always resolved the equation before he was tested. She thought, he is about to discover what happens when you don't. She reached into the pocket of the servant's wrap and took out the archivist's key, held it up so Aldrich could see it clearly, watched his eyes move to it. "Here is what happens now," she said. Her voice was even, not loud. She didn't need loud. She needed precise. "You release her, both of them. You step aside, and you let us reach the archive." Aldrich's expression did not change. Or the document I wrote this morning is already on its way to 3 noble houses in this capital. She watched his eyes, watched the flicker. "I wrote 2 copies. You assumed I had one. That was a reasonable assumption. It was wrong." She was lying. She had written 1 copy, but the lie was structurally sound, and she delivered it in the same register as the truth, without a breath's difference between them, because her father had spent 23 years teaching her how to perform certainty she didn't entirely feel, and she had been an attentive student. The first messenger left the village while we were still standing at the well. By noon, Lord Castellan Harwick will have read the name of every seized village in the southern province. By evening, the story has a shape. By morning, the shape has a name. Aldrich looked at her for a long time. The guards had not moved. The door to the throne hall was still closed. Lucien was still not looking at her, was still looking at Calla, was holding himself in the particular stillness of a man who has surrendered the wheel and is waiting to see where the road ends. "You're bluffing," Aldrich said. "You need me alive," she said, "undamaged, publicly willing. You need me to stand at an altar in 48 hours and perform a marriage that legitimizes an infrastructure program that is currently running on tax revenue that would, if made public, dismantle the legal basis for the road and potentially the alliance. You need this very specific thing from me, and you need it on a timeline." She looked at him without blinking. "How certain are you?" The silence lasted long enough that one of Aldrich's soldiers shifted his weight. Aldrich looked at the key in her hand. He looked at her face. He was doing the arithmetic she had wanted him to do. The real arithmetic, the one that weighed certainty against risk, that measured the cost of being wrong against the cost of yielding a small amount of ground. "The woman and the captain," he said finally, "are not my leverage. They are your father's." "Then get out of my way," she said, "and let me settle my father's debts myself." Another silence. Longer. Aldrich stepped to the side of the corridor. She walked forward, past him, past his soldiers, past the throne hall door. She did not look at his face as she passed, not defiance, not performance. She simply did not have any attention to spare for what was on his face, because all of her attention was on the corridor ahead, on the archive door at its end, on the next 3 minutes and what they needed to produce. Lucien was beside her before she had taken 10 steps, and Calla was with him. He had simply taken her arm and walked, and the guards, without a clear order to stop them, had not stopped them. They reached the archive door. She put the archivist's key in the secondary lock. Her father's seal key. She didn't have it. She had planned to deal with that when she reached the archive, had held in reserve a set of options that ranged from forcing the mechanism to finding another entrance. But when she pressed the door, it opened. She stood very still. The door was already unlocked. She looked at Lucien. His expression told her he was doing the same arithmetic she was, arriving at the same place, and he said it before she did. He unlocked it. She pushed the door open slowly and looked inside. The archive was a long, low room, lined floor to ceiling with shelving. The shelves organized by year and province, and the careful cross-referencing system of a meticulous institution. At the far end of the room, on the central table, a single lamp burned, and a set of documents had been laid out with the neat, deliberate arrangement of something prepared for examination. She walked to the table. She looked at the documents. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked up, at the room, at the shelves, at the lamp burning with the same indifference that all the candles in Blackthorn Palace had always burned with, at the walls of an archive that her father had unlocked and prearranged. And she understood, with the full weight of 23 years of watching him work, that she had not outmaneuvered her father tonight. He had let her think she had. The documents on the table were real. She could see that. The official seals, the signatures, the clauses. The alliance agreement with the infrastructure provisions exactly as she had described them. The revenue accounts for the water tax program, the labor conversion records, the road project expenditure in her father's comptroller's hand. All of it, laid out and waiting. Her father was not trying to stop her from taking the documents. He was making sure she did. She picked up the nearest page with a hand that was entirely steady and read it. Read it carefully. Read the clauses she had expected, and then read the clause she had not expected, the one at the bottom of the third page, the one that had her name on it, the clause that specified Princess Seraphina Vale as co-signatory on the alliance agreement. A signature that was witnessed and dated 4 months ago by 2 members of the Royal Council, and that bore what was unmistakably her seal, the small oval of amber and silver that she wore on her right hand, the seal her mother had made for her when she came of age, the seal she had never once voluntarily applied to any document she had not written herself, a seal that could be applied to a document by anyone who had access to the ring. She looked at her right hand, at her mother's ring, at the amber oval. She looked at the date on the document. 4 months ago she had been ill. A fever that had lasted 10 days, during which she had been largely bedridden and occasionally not entirely coherent, during which her ladies had come and gone, and her father had visited twice with great visible concern, during which she had not, to her knowledge, signed anything. She stood in the archive of Blackthorn Palace and held her mother's ring and felt the cold structure in her chest undergo a transformation that was not collapse but was something close to it. The structural shift of a load-bearing wall discovering that the ground beneath it has been removed not suddenly, but incrementally, over months, in increments too small to register as loss until the sum of them became visible all at once. She was not holding evidence against her father. She was holding evidence against herself. Her name on the alliance agreement, her seal on the infrastructure clauses, her apparent co-authorization of the water tax program and the labor conversion and the road construction and everything that built on top of everything else. If these documents were made public, and her father had laid them out to be made public, had unlocked the door and lit the lamp and arranged them with the care of a man presenting a gift, the story would not be the story of a king's corruption exposed by his daughter. It would be the story of a conspiracy authored by them both, and a princess who had run when the consequences approached. She looked at Lucien. Lucien was looking at the document, at her seal. His face was doing something she had never seen it do. Not the composed deliberation, not the rawness she'd glimpsed in the pre-dawn dark, but something that preceded both of those. Something that was the face a person wears in the second before they decide what face to wear. "He's been building this for 4 months, she said. Her voice came out different than she expected. Not flat. Not the administrative register. Something rawer than that. Something that had come up from below the cold structure and forced itself through it. The entire time I was planning to leave, he was building the version of it where leaving destroys me." Lucien picked up the document carefully. Read the clause. Read the signature and seal. Set it back down. "He needs you compliant or ruined," he said. Those were always the only 2 options he was working toward. She looked at the documents. At her name. At her mother's ring. She thought, you can walk out of this room and destroy the documents, and there are no originals. You can deny the signature. You can contest the seal. You can spend years in a legal and political fight that your father will fund against you with the full resources of a crown. She thought, or you can use them. She looked at her seal on her father's document and felt something shift in her that was not the cold structure and was not the rawness underneath it, but was something that had been forming all night in the space between them. Something that had no name yet because she had not needed a name for it until this moment. She had spent 23 years being her father's subject, his prop, his collateral, his performance of paternal devotion. She had spent the last 6 hours discovering what she had been the subject of without knowing. She picked up the document, all of them, every page on the table. "The seal is mine," she said, quietly, to Lucien, to herself, to the lamp and the walls and the 23 years of walls. "The signature is mine whether I wrote it or not. My name is on this. My name has been on this." She put the documents inside the servant's wrap, alongside the folded journal page with the village names. She straightened. She looked at the archive door, open behind them, and the corridor beyond it, and the throne hall at the corridor's end. Her father was in there. She could feel it the way she had always been able to feel, where he was in a building. The particular gravity of a man who had never in his life not been the center of a room. She had spent 23 years being what the room required. She was going into that room. But she was done deciding what she was from the inside of it. She looked at Lucien and saw him looking at her. And what was on his face in that moment, the thing she still didn't have a name for, the thing rawer than composure and older than the calculation, she held it in her chest not as comfort and not as evidence, but as the single human thing she had that was not her father's architecture. "Stay close," she said. She walked out of the archive toward the throne hall, with her name in her hands and her mother's ring on her finger, and nothing behind her that she was willing to go back for. The throne hall doors were 12 feet tall and built from blackthorn oak, iron-banded, the kind of doors designed to make the person walking through them feel the full weight of what waited on the other side. Seraphina put both hands flat against them and pushed. They opened without resistance. Her father had left them unlocked. Of course he had. Every door tonight had been exactly as open or as closed as he needed it to be. And she walked through this one with the documents pressed against her ribs, and Lucien 2 steps behind her and Calla behind him. And she let the doors swing wide because she was done managing her own entrance for anyone's benefit. The throne hall of Blackthorn Palace was built for a single visual effect, the convergence of every architectural line in the room toward the dais at the far end, where the throne sat on its 3-step elevation like a period at the end of a sentence that had been drafting itself for 300 years. The ceiling was vaulted, the ribs of it drawing the eye upward and then forward, the tall windows on the east wall flooding the space with the particular quality of early morning light that turned everything it touched a pale, indifferent gold. Her father sat on the throne. He was dressed as he had been at the banquet, formal, measured, not a thread out of place. He had the particular stillness of a man who has decided to perform patience rather than feel it, and he was doing it well, which was the thing about her father. He was always doing everything well in the technical sense, always hitting his marks, always operating at the precise register the situation required. She had inherited that from him. She had been furious about it for years, and was currently using it to walk across a throne hall, with her chin level and her pulse at a controlled 140, while every instinct in her body was doing something else entirely. He watched her approach. He did not look at Lucien. He did not look at Calla. He looked at Seraphina the way he had always looked at her, with the complete evaluative attention of a man who has never once seen her as anything other than a variable in an equation he was running. She stopped 20 feet from the dais. "You read them," he said. Not a question. "I read them." "Then you understand the position." "I understand the position you built," she said. "Yes." He let a small silence open. The practiced silence of a man who uses silence as a tool, who has learned that most people will fill silence with something he can use. She did not fill it. "Sit down, Seraphina," he said. "No." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not surprise, something more interior than either. The fractional adjustment of a man whose equation has produced a result that requires re-examination. "The signature is real," he said. "Whatever you intend to claim about how it was obtained, the legal standing is established. 2 council witnesses, a properly sealed document, a date of record. The courts of this kingdom and every allied kingdom will recognize its validity. He let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. You're co-author of this alliance. You can stand against it publicly, and I will let the documents speak for themselves. She reached inside the servant's wrap and took out the documents, all of them. She held them in both hands and looked at them and then looked at him. You're right, she said. The signature is real. My seal is on it. My name is part of this. She looked up. So is everything that was done under it. The villages, the water tax, the labor camps, the road. My name is on all of it. He waited. Which means I have standing, she said. Not as a victim of it, as a party to it. I have co-signatory standing on the alliance agreement, which means I have the legal authority to contest its implementation, to demand a full accounting of the provincial revenue program, to invoke the council review process that the charter requires when a co-signatory raises a formal objection. She watched his face, watched the equation running. You gave me standing when you forged my seal onto this document. You gave me a legal instrument and I intend to use it. The silence in the throne hall was total. Her father looked at her for a long time. Not the evaluative look. Something older than that. Something she had seen on his face only once before, years ago, when her mother was dying and he had stood in the doorway of the sick room with the expression of a man who has encountered the single variable his system does not have a response for. She had been 8 years old. She had not known what the expression meant then. She understood it now. It was the face he made when the equation broke. You've thought this through, he said. On a dirt road at dawn with no sleep, she said. Yes. He stood up from the throne. He was not a tall man, average height, the kind of build that conveyed authority through posture rather than size. And when he stepped down from the dais and walked toward her, he looked, for the first time in her memory, like a man who was simply a man. No dais, no elevation. Just her father, crossing a stone floor toward her. He stopped 6 feet away. You understand what happens if you pursue this, he said. Low now, almost quiet, the voice he used only when there was no audience to perform for. The council review will take months. The Northern Alliance will destabilize. Aldrich will withdraw and look for alternative partners, which means the border fortifications we've relied on for 40 years become negotiable. The kingdom's security is not abstract, Seraphina. It has a cost, and the cost has been paid by people I could not ask for consent from. You could have, she said. You chose not to. Consent doesn't build roads, he said. Consent doesn't hold borders. Consent is the luxury of people who don't have to make the actual decisions. You tax their water, she said. The flatness cracked slightly on the last word. Not much, barely a surface fracture, but enough that she heard it and pressed it back down. You took the thing they needed to survive and you put a price on it, and when they couldn't pay you, turned them into labor. That is not a security decision. That is not a border calculation. That is a man deciding that some people's survival is a resource. Her father looked at her. His face was doing something she had spent 23 years trying to read, and had never fully succeeded at. The interior movement of a man whose convictions and whose awareness of what those convictions had cost were operating simultaneously in the same expression without resolving into either. The world does not run on what should be, he said. It runs on what is. Then I'm going to change what is, she said, starting today. He looked at the documents in her hands. He looked at her face. He looked, briefly, and with an expression she had no category for, at Lucien standing behind her. The captain, he said, you're still trusting him. I'm using what I have, she said. You taught me that. Something crossed her father's face that might have been in a different life, something like pride. It was gone in under a second. He turned and walked back toward the dais. Not retreating, repositioning. He put 2 fingers against the arm of the throne and looked at the east windows, at the morning light coming through them, and she watched his back and waited, because she was not going to make the mistake of thinking this was over when it wasn't over. Graves, he said. The chamberlain materialized from the side passage beside the dais. He had been there the entire time. Convene the council, her father said. Full session, 2 hours. He paused. And send word to Lord Aldrich that the ceremony timeline requires revision. The chamberlain withdrew without sound. Her father turned back to face her. His expression had completed its reorganization, back to the composed, evaluative register, the face that ran equations. But the equation it was running was different now. She could see that. She had changed the variables and he was working with the new set, and he had not, she noted, called the guards. 2 hours, he said. You want the council to hear this? They'll hear it. But you walk into that session as my daughter and co-signatory, not as an adversary. The distinction matters for what comes after. She looked at him. After, she said. The kingdom doesn't end today, he said. Whatever happens in council, this country still needs a functioning crown. You understand that. I know you do because I raised you, and I know what I gave you, even if I gave you nothing else worth keeping. He held her gaze. Be useful in there, not against me, with me. She stood very still and felt the full weight of it. Not the appeal, which she could hold off, but the shape of the world it pointed at, the kingdom's machinery, the border, the 40 years of fortification, the fact that the road, however it was built, was 3 months from completion and tied to a security infrastructure that people were depending on for reasons that had nothing to do with Aldrich's ambitions or her father's methods. She thought, this is what power actually is. Not the throne, not the dais, not the iron-banded doors. The weight of the thing that keeps running whether you approve of it or not, that requires someone to run it, that does not pause while you decide what kind of person you want to be. She thought, he raised you to know this and used the knowledge to keep you compliant and is trying to use it the same way right now. She thought, it is still true. 2 hours, she said. I'll be in the council session, as myself. She held the documents. All of this goes on the table, everything. The villages, the labor program, the road financing, my signature and how it was obtained, all of it. She looked at him steadily. And you will not obstruct it. Her father looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, agreed. She turned and walked toward the throne hall doors, and she had taken perhaps 10 steps when she heard it. Not from her father, not from the dais, but from the side corridor to the left, the one that connected the throne hall to the outer ceremonial rooms where the banquet guests had been housed overnight. The door from the side corridor opened. Aldrich came through it. Not alone, sire. 6 soldiers behind him, northern livery, the weight and movement of men who had been given orders and were following them with the flat efficiency of people who do not require reasons. His face was set in the expression she had read in the corridor earlier, the expression that had recategorized her as an obstacle, and he was looking not at her but at her father. We had an agreement, he said. Not to her, to the king. His voice was entirely without the performance of the corridor. This was the voice underneath it, the northern flat vowels stripped of everything except the intention they were carrying. The girl signs at the ceremony or the alliance terms revert to the military option. You told me this morning she was contained. Lord Aldrich, her father said, the composed register. The timeline requires... I don't care about the timeline. Aldrich stepped further into the hall, and his soldiers spread with him, the practiced fan movement of men who have done this before in rooms that required it. I care about the road. The road is 3 months from completion. The labor contracts run through the Crown's provincial program. If this alliance dissolves before the road is complete, the contracts dissolve with it, and I lose 3 years of investment and 400 miles of half-finished infrastructure. His eyes moved to Seraphina then. Not the marketplace assessment, something colder than that. She signs today. Whatever else is being negotiated happens after. Seraphina stood in the center of the throne hall floor and looked at Aldrich and felt something she had not felt anywhere in the last 12 hours. Not the cold structure, not the rawness beneath it, but something more acute. The specific physical awareness of a situation whose variables have just exceeded her ability to control all of them simultaneously. 6 armed soldiers between her and the door, Aldrich in front of her, her father behind her on the dais, Lucian to her left, and she could feel him running his own arithmetic without looking at him, could feel the shift in his posture that meant he had already counted the men and the distances and was 3 moves ahead of the current moment. Calla was still in the corridor outside. She did not let herself think about that. Aldrich took another step toward her. Give me the documents. No, she said. He looked at her with the flat, functional patience of a man who has decided the path is straight, and the only remaining question is how much friction it involves. I'm not asking. I know. She stood exactly where she was. You're going to need to be. He moved fast for a big man. She registered that in the half-second before Lucian was between them, not as a conscious decision she had seen him make, but as a conclusion he had apparently reached before the question was fully asked. Because that was Lucien. That was always Lucien, the half-beat of deliberation that happened faster than it looked. He put himself between Aldrich and Seraphina with the particular placement of a man who has done close protection work long enough that the geometry of it is automatic. And Aldrich stopped. The 6 northern soldiers had not stopped. They moved. Not at Seraphina, at Lucien, the tactical read of men who identified the obstacle and addressed it. And Lucien moved with them, and for a moment the throne hall contained something that was not yet a fight, but was the breath before one. All the pressure of it compressed into the specific few seconds in which each person in the room was deciding whether the next thing happened. Her father's voice came from the dais. "Aldrich, stand down your men." Aldrich did not look away from Lucien. "The treaty terms are clear, Aldous. I've been patient." "Stand down," her father said again, and this time there was something different in his voice. Not the administrative calm, not the performance of authority, but the actual voice of a man who is looking at something he did not intend to create and does not want to own. "This is not how this ends." Aldrich looked at the king. Something moved between them. The complex, compressed communication of 2 men who have been negotiating for years and can have entire arguments in a single-held gaze. She watched it. She watched her father's face and saw, for the second time in one morning, the expression he made when the equation broke. He had not known about the soldiers. She was certain of it. He had known Aldrich was a hard man with hard methods, had used that hardness as a tool in his own calculations, and had not fully reckoned with the fact that tools have their own intentions. Aldrich made a small gesture with his right hand. The soldiers did not advance, but they did not stand down. "The documents," Aldrich said to Seraphina, without inflection. "The key. And you walk to the ceremony under your own feet, which I am told you prefer. Those are the terms. They were the terms before this morning, and they are the terms now." She looked at him. She looked at the soldiers. She looked at Lucian's back, at the set of his shoulders, at the particular tension in him that was not fear. She knew him well enough to know it wasn't fear. It was something more deliberate than fear. The controlled compression of a man who has decided something and is waiting for the right moment to execute it. She looked at her father on the dais. She looked at the documents in her hands. She thought, "You walked into this room with a legal instrument and a plan that required a council session and 2 hours and a functioning process. You built it carefully. It was a good plan." She thought, "It required the room to behave like a room and not like a trap." She thought, "You know what a trap looks like." She reached into the servant's wrap and pulled out the folded journal page. The document she had written at the well, the village names, the tax structure, the road connection, the foundation of everything she was trying to build. She held it separately from the archive documents. 2 different things, 2 different kinds of evidence. She looked at Aldrich. "You want the archive documents," she said. "Those are mine. They have my seal on them. You cannot take them without taking me. And if you take me, you create a situation that cannot be presented as a voluntary alliance." She kept her voice level. "But this," she held up the journal page, "is not an archive document. This is my handwriting on a torn page. This is the version of the story that exists outside this building already. You cannot take that. It's already gone." Aldrich's eyes moved to the page, to her face, back to the page. "You said a messenger," he said slowly. "I said a messenger left while we were at the well." She looked at him. "I didn't say what they were carrying." The silence that followed had a different texture than any of the silences before it. Not the negotiating silence, not the calculating silence, but the specific silence of a man who is determining whether he has been outmaneuvered or is being told he has been outmaneuvered, and whether the distinction matters. It was into this silence that the throne hall's main doors opened, not the ceremonial way, not the controlled, managed way doors opened in Blackthorn Palace under normal circumstances. They opened the way they had opened when she had pushed them, fast, both panels, with the impetus of multiple people from the outside. 4 men came through. Not soldiers, she registered that first, then registered the livery. Not Blackthorn livery. The house colors of Castellan Harwick, the northern provincial lord whose name she had written on a journal page in a village without a name on any map, not 3 hours ago. Behind them, moving with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been awake since receiving an urgent delivery and had ridden hard and arrived with something specific to say, was Lord Harwick himself. He was in his 50s, broad-faced, the kind of man who had made his position through the particular combination of genuine administrative competence and the willingness to be useful to whoever was currently most useful to be useful to. She had met him 3 times. He had always been cordial in the way that people are cordial when they are waiting to understand what something costs. He stopped inside the doors, looked at the room, at Seraphina, at Aldrich's soldiers, at the king on the dais, and the look on his face told her everything she needed to know about what he had read in the documents that had reached him and what he had decided to do about it. "Your Majesty," he said, formal, precise, the voice of a man who has chosen a side this morning and wants the record to reflect that the choice was made in the proper register. "I received a communication this morning regarding the Provincial Revenue Program and its connection to the Northern Alliance infrastructure." He paused. He looked at Seraphina. "I came to understand the situation directly." Aldrich turned, looked at Harwick, looked at Seraphina. She watched his face complete its recalculation in real time. Watched the moment when the arithmetic stopped producing a result he could act on, when the variables exceeded the plan's tolerance, when the man who needed a compliant princess at an altar in 48 hours understood that the princess had been 2 moves ahead of him since before he entered the building. Aldrich looked at the king. "You told me she was contained." Her father said nothing. "You told me the situation was managed." Her father looked at Seraphina. Not at Aldrich, at Seraphina. And on his face, for the 3rd time this morning, was the expression she had spent her whole life trying to read. And this time, finally, she had a name for it. It was the expression of a man who has looked at an equation and understood that the variable he has been trying to solve for was, the entire time, the one doing the solving. She stood in the center of the throne hall with the documents against her ribs, and Harwick behind her and Lucien in front of her, and Aldrich's 6 soldiers between her and the exit, and she felt the full, unmanageable weight of the moment pressing against every surface of her. She thought, this is the moment. Not the archive, not the council session, not the 2 hours her father offered. This room, right now, with everyone in it. She thought, you have standing, a witness, and a man who came here because he read what you wrote and decided it was worth writing for. She thought, the door is behind Harwick, and it is open, and if you run, everything collapses. She thought, you are done running. She turned to face the room. All of it, Aldrich and his soldiers and her father and Harwick and the open doors and the morning light through the east windows. And she opened her mouth to speak, and Aldrich's lead soldier moved, not toward her, toward Lucien, the obstacle, the calculation, the thing between the objective and the objective's resolution. And Lucien was already turning when the man's hand connected with his shoulder and drove him sideways into the throne hall's stone floor with a sound that was impact and breath and the specific, awful crack of a person meeting stone at force. She heard herself say his name, not the flat administrative voice, not the cold register, the actual version of her voice, the one that existed below all the performances. And she was moving toward him before she had decided to move. The document scattering from her hands across the stone floor, the journal page spinning loose. And one of Aldrich's other soldiers stepped into her path with both arms out in the practiced obstruction of a man who has been told not to harm, but has been told to hold. She did not stop. She drove her elbow into his forearm with everything the last 12 hours had built in her bum. Not training. She had no training, but something more functional than training. The absolute refusal of a woman who has spent one night becoming something she is not going back from, channeled through bone and forward momentum, and the specific rage of a person who has decided the cost is paid, and she is collecting. The soldier took a step back. Just one. But one was enough. She got to Lucien. He was already pushing himself upright, one arm braced on the floor, the other hand pressed to the side of his head where it had met the stone. Blood. Not much. A cut above the temple, the kind that bleeds more than it damages. His eyes were clear. She grabbed his arm and pulled, and he came up. "I'm fine," he said. The deliberate voice, slightly compressed, the voice of a man who is managing pain the same way he manages everything. "You're bleeding. I'm aware." He looked at the soldier who had moved, then at Aldrich. the look of a man who has updated his assessment and is operating on the new version. Aldrich looked at Seraphina, at the documents scattered across the floor, at Harwick, who had not moved from the doorway and whose men had positioned themselves with the quiet efficiency of people who were waiting for a direction, at the king, who had still not spoken. "Aldous," Aldrich said. Final, flat, the voice of a man calling in the last thing that was owed to him. Last chance. Honor the agreement. Her father looked at the throne hall, at Aldrich's soldiers, at Harwick, at Seraphina and Lucian standing in the center of the room with blood on his temple and the documents on the floor between them. He looked at his daughter. The silence lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the throne hall of Blackthorn Palace held the entire weight of 30 years of decisions and the full cost of what those decisions had built, and the specific irreversible moment in which the sum of them either continued or didn't. Her father opened his mouth, and from the far side of the east wall, loud enough to be heard through 3 feet of stone and glass, came the sound of a crowd. Not the crowd of a festival, not the crowd of a market, but the particular density of a large number of people who have been given information and have come to the building where the information originated to make their presence and possession of it known. Seraphina looked at Harwick. Harwick looked at her with the expression of a man who had not ridden here alone, who had come with 4 men in the speed of urgency, who had not, she understood it only now, in the middle of everything, who had not been the first person to receive what she had sent. "How many?" she said. "Every house in the capital district with a gate guard who was awake before dawn," he said. "Your message was efficiently distributed, Your Highness." A pause. It helped that it came with a seal. She looked at her hand, at her mother's ring, at the amber oval. She had not stamped a seal on the journal page. She had not had wax or a flame to seal it with. She was certain she had not. She looked at Lucien. He was looking at her ring, and on his face was the expression she had been trying to name since the pre-dawn dark on the market road, the one rawer than composure and older than calculation, the one that had been there the whole time. "I had a second rider," he said, quietly, "waiting in the mill lane, before I came after you, before the chapel." He held her gaze. "In case." She stared at him. "In case the deal went through and you were gone and there was no other option," he said. "The rider had a sealed copy, your seal, which I—" "Yes." He said it without flinching. "I had access to the seal. I made a copy weeks ago. For this. For if it was ever needed." He paused. "I didn't know I was going to need it for something you wrote." She stood in the center of the throne hall and looked at the man who had accessed her seal without her knowledge and used it tonight to distribute her handwritten document to every noble house in the capital, and she felt something that was entirely outside the taxonomy of everything she had been feeling for the last 12 hours. Something that had no infrastructure, no cold structure, no administrative register. Something that was purely and inconveniently human. She put it aside. Later. She bent and picked up the archived documents from the floor. Every page. She straightened. The crowd outside was louder now. The east windows, facing the palace's ceremonial approach, were beginning to show movement, not just sound, but shadow, the particular shadow density of a large number of people gathered at the gates. Aldrich looked at the windows. He looked at his soldiers, at Harwick's men in the doorway, at the king on the dais, at Seraphina. He was doing arithmetic that was producing results he had not planned for, and she watched him do it, and she watched the moment when the results exceeded the plan, and she watched what a man looks like when he is standing in a room where the power has shifted and he is the last one in the room to have noticed. He was still standing there, still armed, still with 6 soldiers who had been given orders that had not been rescinded. Her father had still not spoken. She looked at the throne, at the man standing beside it, at the crown he wore, which was blackthorn iron and looked like exactly what it was. Old, heavy, built for permanence, requiring the person who wore it to become the shape it demanded. She looked at her father's face. She said, quietly, across the throne hall, to the man who had raised her on appearances and negotiation and the weight of what should not be examined too closely, "It's over." He looked at her. The equation was gone from his face. All the running calculations, all the composed management of variables, all 30 years of making the world into something he could control from a throne above it. All of it for one unguarded second, was simply gone. What was left was a man. Just a man. "Surrender the chamber," she said, "or I walk out those doors and I let that crowd in, and we find out what happens when Blackthorn Palace has to explain itself without anyone managing the room." Aldrich's lead soldier looked at his lord. Aldrich looked at Harwick, at the doors, at the sound through the east windows, which was now unmistakably the sound of people who were not leaving. He looked at the king. "Aldous," he said. One word. The last call on a debt. And King Aldous Vale of Blackthorn looked at his daughter, standing in the center of his throne hall, with her dead wife's ring on her hand and another man's blood on her borrowed clothes and 30 years of his education deployed against everything he had used it to build. And he did something she had never once seen him do in 23 years. He looked away first. Aldrich saw it. The 6 soldiers saw it. The throne hall held the full weight of what that meant in a silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last. And then Aldrich turned toward the doors, not fast, not slow, with the particular dignity of a man who has made a calculation and does not intend to let the result show on his face. And his soldiers turned with him, and they walked. Harwick's men stepped aside, let them through, did not follow. The throne hall doors closed, and in the silence that remained, the specific, enormous silence of a room from which all the violence has been removed without anything yet having been resolved, Seraphina stood with the documents and heard her own breathing and heard Lucian's breathing beside her and heard, through the east windows, the crowd that was still there, that was not going to disperse until something answered it. That was the thing she had built out of a journal page and a ring and 12 hours of not stopping. She looked at the doors. She looked at the documents in her hands. She looked at her father on the dais. And she understood with a certainty that arrived complete and irreversible that the thing she was about to do next would determine not just what happened today in this hall, but what Blackthorn meant from this day forward, what the crown was, who it belonged to, what it was willing to do and willing to stop doing in the name of the people outside those gates who were waiting in the morning cold to find out whether the story they had been sent was true. She put her foot on the first step of the dais, then the second. Then she was standing at the level of the throne, on the platform her family had built to keep everyone else 6 inches below them, and she turned and faced the room from it for the first time. The doors to the ceremonial approach were at the far end, closed. Behind them, the crowd. She looked at the documents, at her seal, at her name. She looked at Lucien, who was looking at her with blood drying at his temple, and the expression she still did not have a word for, and she thought, later. All of it, later. Every conversation about every choice and what it cost and what it meant and whether trust was a thing you rebuilt or a thing you started over. Later. She looked at her father. "Open the doors," she said. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Graves, who had been in the room the entire time, who was always in the room the entire time. The chamberlain crossed to the ceremonial doors at the far end of the hall, put his hands on the iron handles, and stopped. He looked back at the king. The question on his face was not whether to open them. The question was whether the king was going to stop him. Seraphina waited. The crowd outside pressed against the silence of the doors, a living weight, the accumulated presence of people who had been handed a piece of paper at dawn and had decided that the piece of paper was worth standing in the cold for, which meant they had decided that what was on the other side of the doors was worth standing in the cold for, which meant they had decided, in that particular wordless way that crowds decide things, that the story was true and that truth had an address, and they had found it. Her father's hand rested on the arm of the throne. She could see it from where she stood. The knuckles, the ring of office, the deliberate stillness of a hand that was not moving. She thought, this is the last moment before it becomes what it becomes. Everything that has happened tonight, the chapel, the road, the archive, the forge of her name, the soldiers, Harwick, all of it, has been building toward this specific second in which her father either stops what is coming or doesn't. She thought, he won't stop it. Not because he has become something other than what he is, but because he is smart enough to understand that stopping it now is the only thing that makes it worse. She thought, you learned that from him too. Her father's hand did not move. Graves opened the doors. The morning light came through first, wide, flat, the full brightness of a day that had been building since before any of them had slept. And with it, the sound, the crowd sound, the density of many voices becoming a single pressure. And Seraphina stood on the dais of the Blackthorn throne and raised the documents in her hands and felt the cold structure in her chest transform. Not dissolve, not disappear, but change state one final time. From the dense, load-bearing thing that had kept her upright through the night into something else. Something that moved forward. And from below the dais, from the center of the hall, from the exact spot where she had stood 12 hours ago in a wedding gown waiting to be retrieved, Lucian looked up at her. His face was still bleeding. His expression was still the one without a name. He said nothing. She looked at the open doors, at the crowd beyond them, at the documents in her hands and the ring on her finger and the empty throne behind her. She took the last breath of the person she had been before tonight, and she began to speak. She spoke for 11 minutes. She knew this afterward because Graves, who had the particular habit of the professionally precise, mentioned it in his account of the morning. 11 minutes, from the moment the ceremonial doors opened to the moment the crowd outside the gates fell silent. Not the silence of a crowd that has been dispersed, the silence of a crowd that has been given something large enough that it needs to sit with it before making any sound at all. She did not read from the documents. She had considered it, had thought, in the 2 seconds between the doors opening and her first breath, about the strategic value of reciting the specifics, the village names, the tax figures, the labor conversion numbers. She had decided against it, not because the specifics didn't matter, because the specifics were not what the people at those gates had come for. They had come because the paper they had received at dawn had told them something true, and they needed to hear whether the person who had written it was still standing, and whether standing meant what they needed it to mean. So she told them what had happened. Not all of it, not the chapel, not the passage, not the private architecture of a night that belonged to her and no one else. She told them what mattered for the public record, what she had found on the countryside road, what the documents in her hands contained, what her name was doing on them, and how it had gotten there, and what she intended to do about it. She spoke in plain sentences. She used the administrative clarity she had learned from her father and put it in service of something her father would not have approved, which felt, for the 11 minutes she was doing it, like the most honest use of the inheritance he had given her. When she finished, the silence held for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it broke, and what came through the open doors was not applause exactly. Applause had a performance in it, a social agreement, the managed sound of people giving approval. This was something more disorganized and more real. The sound of people who have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have just been told, credibly and specifically, that someone else is going to help them carry it. She stood on the dais and listened to it and felt nothing triumphant. She had expected to feel something triumphant, and she didn't. What she felt was closer to the first clear breath after a long illness. Not joy, not victory, but the simple structural relief of air moving correctly through a system that had been obstructed. She looked down at the documents in her hands. She looked at the throne behind her. She did not sit in it. She stepped down from the dais, all 3 steps, and walked to the center of the hall, and stood on the floor with everyone else. Her father had not moved. He was still beside the throne, one hand on its arm, and when she looked at him, he was looking at the open doors, at the crowd sound coming through them, with the expression of a man listening to the specific sound of something he built operating outside his control for the first time. She walked to him. Not fast. The unhurried pace of a woman who has nowhere to run and has decided she is done running in any direction. She stopped 4 feet from him, close enough to speak without the room hearing, far enough that the distance said what it needed to say. "The council session," she said. 2 hours. You're going to attend." He looked at her. His face had not recovered the composed register. She didn't think it was going to, not today, possibly not ever in quite the same way. What was on it instead was something older and less managed. The face of a man standing in the rubble of a structure he spent his life building, assessing what the rubble is made of. "And the charges," he said. His voice was low. Not the performance of low, actually quiet, the voice of a man who has reduced himself to the necessary register. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's not my determination to make alone. The council, the provincial representatives, the families affected by the labor program, they have standing in something quieter," he said. "A council report, a formal objection through proper channels, the kind of thing that creates consequences without anyone having to stand on a dais and speak to a crowd." He looked at the candle. Something that didn't require you to be the one standing in the middle of it. She looked at him. It was always going to require me, she said. You knew that. You've known me for 4 years. Yes, he said. I knew that. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time since she had sat down, and his face in the candlelight was entirely visible. The composed surface and the raw thing underneath it both present simultaneously, not alternating. I thought if I could protect you from having to be the instrument of it, I was doing something worth doing. You were making the decision for me, she said. Yes, like everyone else did. He held her gaze. Yes, that's what I was doing. And I can tell you the reasons, and I can tell you that the reasons were not the same reasons as your father's reasons. And I can tell you that I believed in the difference between them, and all of that is true, and none of it changes what it was. She sat with that, with the honesty of it, which was not the same as the absence of harm, but which was, she was learning this, the specific shape of it, the way you learn something that doesn't exist in any text you've read. Something that required a different category than either innocence or guilt. The candle burned low between them. Calla, she said. She's well, he said. She was always, we were never, he stopped, reorganized. She is someone I was responsible for keeping safe. She is not someone who chose to be part of any of this, who knew what I was doing, who had any role in it. She has a child who has nothing to do with any of it. He looked at the wall. I would do it again, keeping her safe. I would do exactly what I did to keep her safe. I need you to know that, and I need you to factor it in. I already did, Seraphina said. He looked at her. I factored it in on the market road, she said. When you stepped between me and Aldrich's soldier, when I understood what the leverage was and why you'd been running 2 calculations simultaneously from the beginning, I factored it in, she paused. It doesn't resolve everything, but it is what it is. And what it is someone doing everything available to them to protect the people they were responsible for. I know what that looks like. I spent 23 years watching it done wrong. You did it differently. He looked at the candle, at the wall, at his own hands. I don't have a title anymore, he said. The panel stripped the captaincy. I have the deposition on record, and my cooperation noted, and a letter of dismissal signed by the acting council chair. He said it without self-pity, the inventory of a man who knows the count and has decided to know it clearly rather than manage how it sounds. I don't have a position in this palace, or in the guard, or in anything connected to the crown. I know, she said. I'm telling you because I want to be honest about what I am right now, and I don't want the honesty to happen later when it costs more. He turned and looked at her again, the full look, the one she had been waiting 6 weeks to have the space for. I'm not asking for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here asking for reinstatement or pardon or for you to tell me the account is settled. I'm here because... He stopped, the half-beat of deliberation, the one she had always known. Because this is the room where I first understood what you were, he said, and I wanted to sit in it for a while. That's all. She looked at the blurred figures on the wall, at the shapes that had once been specific and were now the suggestion of having been. At the low ceiling and the cold air, and the lamp ledge where she had set the oil lamp 6 weeks ago in a wedding gown, waiting for the wrong version of something. She thought about what it cost to trust, not the risk of it. She had always known the risk, had grown up inside the architecture of what happened when trust was used as a tool. She thought about the actual cost, the labor of it, the daily decision, which was not made once but remade continuously in the small exchanges and the silences and the moments of not knowing and choosing to move forward anyway into the not knowing without requiring certainty first. She thought, you will never be certain, about him or about anyone. Certainty is the thing your father sold you as love, the managed appearance of it, the controlled variable, the environment designed to produce a specific and predictable result. The real thing does not produce predictable results. The real thing requires you to remain present in the uncertainty and keep choosing it anyway. She thought, you are 23 years old and you have just run an empire overnight, and you are sitting in a cold chapel with a man you cannot resolve into a simple category. And that is not a problem to be solved. That is, in fact, what it means to be alive. She did not say any of that. It was not the kind of thing that needed to be said to him. It was the kind of thing you say to yourself, in the interior place where the things that actually form you live. I'm going to restructure the guard, she said, the appointment process, the chain of command, the oversight structure. It needs to be done by someone who knows where the vulnerabilities are. He looked at her. That's not an offer of reinstatement, she said. That's a description of work that needs doing and the observation that you have relevant knowledge. She looked at him. The rest of it is separate. It's separate and it's slower and it does not get resolved in a chapel on a Tuesday. No, he said, but it's not closed. He held her gaze. In the candlelight, with no dais and no corridors, and no versions of either of them that had been built for anyone else's benefit, she could see him plainly. The exhaustion of the weeks, the stripped-down honesty of a man who had been through a reckoning and had come out the other side with fewer things but a clearer account of what he had. The cut above his temple had healed to a thin scar. Not closed, he said. The candle burned down to its base and the flame lowered and the chapel dimmed by degrees around them. The old stone and the damp air and the blurred figures on the wall absorbing the dark the way they had absorbed everything for centuries. Without drama, without judgment, with the patient indifference of things that outlast the specific human urgencies that happen in front of them. She sat in the first pew and breathed, and the breathing was even and unlabored and her own. She thought about the last 6 weeks, about what had been built and what had been dismantled and what had turned out to be load-bearing and what had turned out to be decoration. About the 11 minutes in the throne hall that she could not entirely remember afterward, could remember the intention, the words she had chosen, the feeling of the crowd sound through the open doors, but not the specific sequence of it, the way you cannot remember clearly the moments when you are most completely yourself. About the village without a name, and Marit's hands, and the children in the back room. About her mother's ring, which was on her finger in the dark, warm from her skin. About her father in the desk by the window, saying, "You'll be good at this." About herself at the door, saying, "I'll be adequate at some of it." Both of those things exactly true. Both of them the beginning of something she did not have the full shape of yet and had decided to stop requiring the full shape of before she was willing to move forward into it. That was the new thing. The thing she had not had before the night of the banquet, and the chapel, and the road, and the morning in the throne hall. Not the cold structure. She had built that herself over years of surviving her father's palace, and it had served its purpose and she honored it for that. But it was not the new thing. The new thing was this, the willingness to move forward into the shape of things before she could see the full outline of them. The willingness to be in the middle of something without controlling all the variables. The willingness to be wrong and to recover from being wrong and to continue. It was not a comfortable thing. It was not supposed to be comfortable. Comfort was what the palace had been selling her whole life. The controlled environment, the managed appearance, the certainty produced by removing everything that could introduce uncertainty. She knew now what comfort cost, and she was not interested in paying it. The candle went out. The chapel was dark, the way it was always dark, completely, evenly, without drama, the dark that had been here before any of them and would be here after. She sat in it for a moment. Then she stood up and pressed her palm flat against the altar ledge in the dark, the way she had pressed it against the passage wall 6 weeks ago in a wedding gown, using her hands to know where she was. She found the edge, found her orientation. She walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Lucy Yen stand. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. They walked out of the chapel and up through the passage and back into Blackthorn Palace, which was not the same building it had been on the night she had run from it. Not because the stones had changed or the corridors or the iron chandeliers with their candles burning at every hour. It was the same stone and the same light. What was different was what moved through it. She walked back into her palace in the dark, with no wedding gown and no performance and no version of herself built for anyone else's approval, and the candles burned in every corridor the way they always had, steady and indifferent. She did not need them to mean anything. They were just light, and she walked through it.